Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
What's going on, everybody? You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Yes, you hear it in my voice. I am a little bit under the weather. This weekend, I went to Charleston, South Carolina, and I celebrated the life of my grandmother. She was 101 years old, and her homegoing celebration was off the chain. It was great. But yes, you hear it in my voice, so please bear with me for this week, okay? But I just like to say good afternoon and welcome to the Afternoon Praise, where we are here to help you reach what? Your defining level of success. And how do we do that? By helping you discover and develop your gifts. For the last several weeks, we talked about systems, sustainabilities, governance, operational structures, maintenance, and stewardship. But this week, we're talking about diagnostic shifts inward. Because eventually, businesses break where leaders break. Organizations drift where internal discipline drifts. Systems weaken where private governance weakens. This week is called the infrastructure of you. That is our theme for the week. Because sustainable leadership requires sustainable people. And today's conversation is not surface motivation. It is executive self-leadership architecture. Today, we are talking about your private routines are auditing your public leadership. Many high-capacity people believe they can compartmentalize. But not just anything. They believe they can compartmentalize stress, emotional disorder, unhealthy routines, nervous system exhaustion, reactive living, private inconsistency, as long as public performance still looks strong. But let me tell you something. Leadership pressure is a diagnostic tool. It does not create character. It exposes structural integrity. And eventually, what you repeatedly practice privately becomes automatic publicly. Let's look at Proverbs 4, verse 23. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. That is governance language, because your public leadership is downstream from your private internal infrastructure. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Join us on this heavenly journey, one song at a time, Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise, and this is Motivation Monday. And again, please forgive me because you know I am under the weather, so I know my voice and everything just sounds crazy. But guess what? We got to stay focused. We got to stay motivated, and we have to keep our foot on the gas and keep moving forward. And today we are talking about the private routines are auditing your public leadership. And I just want to talk about your private life is training your public reaction. See, most people think leadership happens publicly. Leadership is actually trained privately. Your routines, your emotional habits, thought patterns, stress responses, and discipline structure. These things, they condition your future leadership reaction every single day. That means how you repeatedly live privately eventually becomes how you automatically lead publicly. Pressure does not magically create wisdom. Pressure reveals conditioning. Your private life is training your public reaction, people. That's leadership psychology. Most people are waiting for a big moment to become disciplined, emotionally mature, or strategically focused. But leadership rarely transforms suddenly in public. It develops gradually in private repetition. The way you handle inconvenience, manage interruptions, process disappointments, respond to frustration, organize your mornings, and governing your attention. This is building the operating system your leadership will eventually run on under pressure. That's why hidden habits matter, people. Because the brain does not distinguish between small moments and important moments. the way people think it does. See, repetition tells the brain this is who we are. And eventually, your private patterns becomes your public defaults. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
You're riding the waves of faith and grace on Wayvve Radio.
If you just tuned in, you tuned into Motivation Monday, and I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. And just like I said before, I'm a little bit under the weather, so that's why I sound crazy, all right? But, excuse me, let's talk about you cannot compartmentalize internal disorder. See, many leaders believe as long as I perform publicly, my private instability doesn't matter. You're wrong. That's a dangerous misunderstanding. Because the brain does not compartmentalize behavioral conditionings the way people think it does. See, if your private life is built on emotional reactivity, inconsistency, mental clutter, unmanaged stress, and constant distractions, those same patterns eventually leak publicly under pressure. Internal disorder eventually creates external friction. That's executive reality, people. Many people think leadership failure starts publicly. It doesn't. But public breakdown is usually the final stage of long-term internal erosion. The emotional instability was already there. The exhaustion was already there. The cognitive overload was already there. Pressure simply accelerated exposure. That's why high capacity leaders must stop thinking I can push through it. I'll deal with it later. It's not affecting my leadership, because unresolved internal instability eventually affects your communication tone, your emotional patience, your strategic thinking, leadership consistency, and your relationship health. And when leaders refuse to govern internal disorder, organizations eventually absorb the consequences externally. And I know you probably said, well, I'm not no executive leader. I'm not leading no big company. You're leading your family. You're leading your ministry. I don't care if your ministry had 10 people, 15 people. I don't care if your family had 2 or 3 people. You are leading, and you are leading on an executive level. So don't even manipulate your own self, your thinking, to be like, oh, this ain't for me. Yes, it is for you. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise, and this is Motivation Monday. See, leadership pressure reveals structural integrity. Pressure is not the enemy, people. Pressure is the revealer. See, when crisis hit, stress rises, pressure increases, uncertainty appears, willpower steps aside, and conditioning takes over. See, that's why many leaders are calm publicly until pressure exposes what was never governed privately. Leadership pressure reveals some things. It reveals emotional maturity, nervous system regulations, behavior discipline, cognitive stability. Pressure exposes the infrastructure underneath the performance. That's operational truth. And many people mistake charisma for capacity. But pressure reveals the difference between performance and structure. Strong infrastructure creates calmness under pressure, strategic thinking under stress, emotional stability during uncertainty. Now, weak infrastructure creates emotional volatility, reactive decisions, communication breakdown, impulsive leadership. That's why pressure is valuable, because pressure exposes. It exposes cracks. It exposes weak foundations. It exposes unresolved emotional instability. And pressure exposes hidden behavioral conditioning. Mature leaders understand exposure is not punishment. It is diagnostic information. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. If you just tuned in, this is Motivation Monday, and we are talking about your private routines are auditing your public leadership. And again, I said this on the other breaks, I am a little bit under the weather, and you can hear it in my voice, but we are still pushing through. Ooh, excuse me. And thank you for the bless yous. So let's talk about broken contracts with yourself. Yes, listen to what I'm saying. Broken contracts with yourself. See, every private routine is reinforcing something. Even small moments matter. When people repeatedly ignore discipline, constantly break personal commitments, normalize inconsistency, and delay structure, the brain begins learning unreliability. That's deeper than motivation, people, because leadership integrity begins internally. And repeated private inconsistency creates subconscious instability. See, many people are trying to lead others while privately losing trust in themselves. And I'm going to say that again. Many people are trying to lead others while privately losing trust in themselves. That's dangerous internal erosion. Every time you repeatedly ignore your own boundaries, delay necessary discipline, abandon structure, avoid accountability, you slowly weaken internal trust. See, that matters psychologically. Because confidence is not built only through success. Confidence is built through self-consistency. Your brain watches your behavior, and eventually your subconscious begin determining whether you are trustworthy to yourself. That's why private discipline matter, people. Not because of image, not because of performance, but because internal reliability creates mental stability, emotional confidence, behavior alignment, and leadership consistency. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Let's talk about neuroplasticity. It's always listening. See, neuroplasticity means the brain continually rewires itself through repetition. That means whatever behavior you repeat constantly becomes neurologically reinforced. See, if your routines repeatedly train distraction, impulsiveness, emotional vitality, inconsistent focus, the brain strengthens those pathways. And eventually, those patterns become automatic under pressure. See, repetition becomes leadership conditioning. That's why private routines matter more than occasional public performance. See, many people think occasionally motivation can override repeated conditioning, but the brain prioritizes repetition over inspiration. What you constantly practice becomes neurologically efficient. That means if your daily routines are training, scattered thinking, divided attention, reactive communication, emotional instability, your brain will eventually default to those patterns automatically. This is why leadership maturity requires behavior awareness. Because every routine is teaching your nervous system how to operate. And eventually, your automatic responses reveal your deepest conditioning. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise, and this is Motivation Monday. If you just joined us, we're talking about your private routines are auditing your public leadership. See, state-dependent leadership. Research around state-dependent learning shows that brain association internal emotional states with behavior patterns. See, this means if you constantly operate privately in stress, panic, hyperventilate, emotional overload, the brain starts linking those states to your decision-making process. And eventually, reactive leadership becomes normalized. That's why unmanaged stress quietly weakens leadership quality over time. You cannot repeatedly train your nervous system in chaos and expect calm leadership under pressure. That's just not happening. That's executive behavioral science. See, many leaders believe they can turn on emotional stability only when necessary. But emotional regulation does not suddenly appear in critical moments. It is conditioned through repeated nervous system patterns over time. And if your internal environment constantly lives in urgency, panic, overstimulation, and exhaustion, your body eventually treats dysfunction like normal operating behavior. That means even when there's no emergency, your nervous system continues operating as if danger is present. And leaders functioning in chronic survival mode often overreact, become impatient, lose cognitive flexibility, struggles with emotional presence, create instability around them, and they're insecure because the nervous system eventually influences communication, perception, leadership tone, and decision-making qualities. That's why internal calmness is not weakness. It's a leadership infrastructure. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Bringing the sounds of heaven 24/7, Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. And again, please forgive me, y'all. I know y'all hear all the heavy breathing and all the sniffing. I might be called, I am under the weather, but that's not going to hold me back from doing what God has blessed me to do. And that is the Afternoon Praise and to talk to you all. So let's talk about your nervous system is carrying your vision. See, many people focus on scaling, execution, performance, growth, but they ignore nervous system stability. See, chronic stress creates cortisol overload, emotional instability, cognitive fatigue, reduced executive functions. See, eventually the body begins shutting down what the mind refuses to regulate. That means your psychology affects your leadership capacity. Sustainable leadership requires sustainable psychology. That's stewardship. Many visionaries attempt to operate beyond the limitations of their biology. They override exhaustion, ignore recovery, normalize sleep deprivation, suppress emotional fatigue, while expecting their leadership quality to remain unaffected. But the body keeps scores. And eventually, the nervous system begins demanding payment for ignored stress. That payment appears through what? Emotional exhaustion, mental fog, reduced patience, you get irritable, impulsive decision making, and burnout. That's why your body is not separate from your assignment. Your body is carrying your vision. And if your leadership destroys the vessel carrying the vision, sustainability eventually collapses. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Let's talk about the allostatic load is quietly draining leaders. See, the allostatic load is the accumulated wear and tear caused by chronic unmanaged stress. Many high-capacity people are privately carrying emotional pressure, mental overload, constant urgency, unresolved tensions without recovery systems. See, eventually the nervous system becomes exhausted. And when that happens, strategic clarity weakens, emotional patience declines, communication sharpens negatively. Decisions quietly, guess what, deteriorates. Your body remembers what your leadership style ignores. The psychological leadership reality. Many leaders think exhaustion is simply part of success. But chronic overload is not sustainable leadership, people. It is accumulated system strain. The body was not designed to carry nonstop urgency, emotional suppression, unresolved tension, chronic overstimulation, perpetual survival mode without consequences. See, eventually, executive fatigue begins affecting your judgment, emotional regulation, creativity, communication, leadership presence, and many leaders misdiagnose the issue. They think they lost motivation, they lost passion, they lost clarity, when in reality, their psychology is overloaded. That's why recovery systems are not optional for high capacity leadership. They are operational necessities. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Let's talk about internal clutter creates cognitive friction. See, unmanaged internal systems create invisible mental taxation. Financial disorder, relational ambiguity, environmental clutter, emotional overload, all of it consumes cognitive bandwidth. And eventually, leaders become mentally congested without realizing why. See, that congestion appears publicly through indecisions, emotional inconsistency, poor communication, reactive leadership. See, internal clutter eventually creates external inefficiency. See, that's operational psychology. Many people underestimate how much energy is lost through unresolved internal friction. Every unresolved issue quietly occupies mental space. See, that means your mind is constantly processing unfinished decisions, unresolved tensions, hidden stress, emotional clutter, and environmental distractions, even while trying to lead effectively. This creates cognitive overload, and overload leaders often procrastinate, lose focus, struggle with execution, becomes emotionally reactive, lose strategic clarity. That's why structure matters internally, because internal organization protects cognitive energy. And cognitive energy is one of the leadership's greatest assets.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. And again, please forgive me for all this sneezing and hacking in the mic. You know, I'm under the weather a little bit. Went to Charleston, South Carolina again to celebrate my grandmother's homegoing, and it was great. She lived to see 101. What a blessing. What a blessing. But let's talk about emotional governance is leadership infrastructure. See, emotional intelligence is not soft leadership. It is infrastructure. Leaders who cannot regulate frustration, pressure, insecurity, and emotional impulses eventually create unstable environments around them. Because leadership emotions are contagious. Teams absorb anxiety, instability, tensions, and emotional unpredictability. That means emotional governance directly affects organization and atmosphere. Emotional governance protects leadership stability. That's executive maturity. Many leaders underestimate how deeply emotions shape environments. But people do not only respond to words, strategy, infrastructure, they also respond to tones, tensions, emotional energy, nervous system signals. That means leadership is constantly transmitting atmospheres. If leadership consistently operates in panic, anger, unpredictability, emotional inconsistency, the organization slowly absorbs those rhythms. And eventually, teams stop functioning from creativity and collaboration. They begin functioning from caution, fear, emotional protection, and vigilance. That's why emotional governance is not optional. It's stabilized environment.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown, and this is Motivation Monday. You cannot sustain an identity you never built privately. See, many people try to perform leadership publicly without building leadership internally. But sustainable identity requires private development. You cannot fake discipline forever, perform calmness forever, or imitate maturity forever. Eventually, pressure exposes what was never developed structurally. You cannot sustainably perform an identity you have never privately built. That's behavioral truth, people. Many people are exhausted because they are performing an image instead of developing infrastructure. Performance drains people. Structure sustains people. That's why some leaders look successful publicly while privately collapsing emotionally. Because public image is not the same as internal development. Eventually, the pressure of scale demands authenticity. Yes. And when the identity has not been strengthened privately, insecurity surfaces, emotional instability appears, reaction behaviors increases, leadership fractures under pressure. That's why private developments matter, because sustainable leadership must become identity-based, not performance-based. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
Let's talk about David was conditioned before the crown. And if you just tuned in, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. See, before David faced Goliath publicly, he was conditioned privately. Before kingship, there was stewardship. Before visibility, there was hidden discipline. David's courage was not random motivation. It was conditioned through private repetition. Protecting sheep, fighting lions, fighting bears, trusting God privately. See, public victories was overflow from private preparation. Private stewardship prepares people for public scales. That's biblical stewardship architecture. Many people want visibility. Many people want influence, expansion, and opportunity, but ignore the conditioning season that prepare leaders structurally. David was not built on the battlefield. He was revealed there. The hidden seasons created courage, discipline, resilience, dependence on God, and emotional stability under pressure. That's why private seasons matter, because God often develops internal strength, emotional maturity, spiritual discipline, leadership structure before public responsibility arrives. And leaders who skip private development often collapse beneath public weight. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown, and this is Motivation Monday. Let's talk about hidden habits shape public culture. See, leadership culture often reflects the private habits of the leader. If leadership privately operates in panic, inconsistency, emotional overload, lack of structure, those patterns eventually influence communication, culture, execution, organizational energy, because leadership always leaks. That's why internal governance matter. Organizations often mirror the hidden rhythms of leadership. That's system psychology. Culture is not created only through policies. Culture is shaped through repeated emotional and behavior patterns modeled consistently by leadership. Teams eventually adapt to the leader's emotional tone, the leader's urgency, the leader's reaction, the leader's communication habits. That means hidden leadership dysfunctions eventually becomes organization atmospheres. And many organizations are unknowingly operating on inherited anxiety, inherited emotional stability, inherited inconsistency, and inherited reactivity. That's why private governance is bigger than personal growth. It affects every environment connected to the leadership. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown, and we are talking about your private routines are auditing your public relationship on this Motivation Monday. See, recovery is an executive responsibility. Many leaders treat recovery like weakness, but recovery protects emotional regulation, executive clarity, long-term stability, sleep, stillness, prayer, reflection, mental decompression. These are not luxury, people. These are recovery systems protecting leadership capacity. Recovery is infrastructure for sustainable execution. That's executive stewardship. Many leaders only value output, but sustainable leaders require restoration, recovery, recalibration, and nervous system regulation. Without recovery, people, the mind loses sharpness, the body loses resilience, the emotion loses regulation, and eventually leaders begin functioning from depletion instead of strength. That's dangerous because depleted leaders often overreact emotionally, lose strategic vision, struggle with patience, communicate from frustration, and create unstable organizational rhythms. That's why recovery is not laziness. Recovery protects longevity, and longevity is one of leadership's greatest responsibility. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
If you got a shout out or request, hit us up, man. We want to hear from you. Let us know where you are listening from. And again, I know I keep apologizing, all the sniffles and the sneezing, but I have to apologize again. And I know you hear me slurring my words. Please forgive me. I could have just took off today, but guess what? We got to learn how to press forward. Okay. And then guess what I'm going to do after the show? I'm going to take some time, get my body right, but we got to learn how to press forward, because our gifts can help someone else get to that next level. But let's talk about stop building publicly while collapsing privately. See, many people are trying to expand publicly, scale publicly, perform publicly, grow publicly, but while privately they are exhausted, emotionally overloaded, mentally fragmented, spiritually depleted. That creates dangerous instability because eventually private collapse interrupts public momentum. Stop building external success on collapsing internal infrastructure. That's leadership wisdom, people. Many leaders spend years building brands, businesses, ministries, organizations while neglecting emotional health, spiritual stewardship, mental clarity, internal discipline, recovery systems. Eventually, the infrastructure underneath the success weakens. And when internal infrastructure weakens long enough, public execution eventually suffers. That's why mature leadership audits. They audit their energy, their emotional stability, their spiritual health, their nervous system sustainability, their behavior consistency. Because sustainable leadership requires sustainable people. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. My time is up. It's been great. It's been lovely. And again, I thank you for helping me push through. Because of you, that's why I'm here pushing through right now through this sickness. But we are good because this was a great show. But let me leave you with this. Luke 16, verse 10. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. The hidden areas matter. Private governance matter. Internal structure matters. This week, we are building the infrastructure of you. And today we expose your private routines are auditing your public leadership. Because pressure reveals conditioning. Emotional governance affect leadership. Nervous systems affect decision making. Private routines shape public execution. Internal disorder creates external friction. And remember this, people. What you repeatedly practice privately eventually becomes automatic publicly. Your private life is not disconnected from your leadership. It is training it. The way you think privately, recover privately, govern emotion privately, organize your routine privately, manage pressure privately, eventually becomes visible publicly under pressure. That means sustainable leadership begins internally, behaviorally, and emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. So this week, stop focusing only on what you are building externally. Audit the infrastructure, carrying the vision, because sustainable leadership requires sustainable people. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. This is Motivation Monday. I thank you for joining me. I will catch you tomorrow for Triumph Tuesday. I am out of here. Peace.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.